I'm Professor Steve and I'm a real paleontologist. You're watching Real Paleontology. And today, I'm going to give you my professional opinion on a particularly vexed question. Was North America's giant short-faced bear a super predator? Indeed, was this huge beast a predator at all? Over the course of its checkered history, it's been variously interpreted as a hypercarnivore, a bone-cracking scavenger, and a herbivore. Some have considered it to be a fast, long-legged pursuit predator, and others have argued that it didn't have long legs at all, nor a particularly short face for that matter. What a mess! Now, I've been researching mammalian carnivores for at least 30 years, since I started my PhD over 30 years ago, and I've seen some things, but this is a tough one. In fact, trying to predict the diet and niche of any extinct bear at all is always going to be difficult. That's because, in a number of key respects, living bears just don't follow the damn rules that have been pretty well established for other mammalian carnivores. And the data are giving us mixed results. Anyway, before we jump into this, let's just quickly establish the identity of this particular giant short-faced bear, because there are a few. We're talking Arctodus simus. It was first described in 1878 from Californian material, although under a different name. It was an Ice Age animal living from around 2.5 million years ago to 13,000 years ago. It's a member of a short-faced bear subfamily called Tremarctinae, which has only one living species, the South American spectacled bear here. There are several other extinct South American short-faced bears, including this guy, Arctodus angustidens, which was the largest bear ever. So, relative to living bears, both giant species fit within this group, represented by the spectacled bear. Arctodus giant North American relative, the subject of this episode, Arctodus simus, was the second largest bear of all time. How large, I hear you ask? Well, pretty damn large. There are various weight estimates available, but a consensus seems to put it at around about 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds, and an average of around 625 kg or 1,400 pounds. That's considerably larger than the biggest living ursid, the polar bear, which maxes out at around 800 kilograms. There was a second smaller species of North American Arctodus, Arctodus pristinus, but I'm not concentrating on this species, and from here on, when I talk about Arctodus, I'm referring specifically to Arctodus simus only. One last bit of backstory here. Bears which comprise the family Ursidae are a pretty recent addition to the mammalian family tree. An important thing to bear in mind is that most living bears are classified as omnivores, herbivores, or insectivores. The only living bear that mostly relies on eating other animals for sustenance is a polar bear. Anyway, back to Arctodus. For decades it was thought that this bear bucked the recent trend and was, in fact, a very effective predator at the very top of the food chain in North America. Probably the most influential work here was produced by Finnish paleontologist Bjorn Curtin, who determined in 1967 that its relatively large slicing cheek teeth, long legs and short skull made it more cat-like than other bears. Ipso facto, it was effectively a giant cat-like hypercarnivore. Now, Curtin was a really interesting character who also wrote award-winning paleo-fiction and fantasy books. These include Before the Indians and Dance of the Tiger. In this second book, Curtin introduced the idea that modern humans drove Neanderthals to extinction through interbreeding. This was decades before it was at all clear that the two species could even interbreed. Anyway, I digress. Curtin's interpretation pretty much held sway until the early 2000s. Although there had been at least some earlier suggestions that Arctodus's superpredator credentials had been overblown. For example, Emsley and Zapluski 1985 argued that it was more herbivore than carnivore based on comparisons with its sole living relative, the spectacled bear. And Mathias 1995 argued that it was more likely to have been a big, wide-ranging scavenger than an active predator, relying on its great size to bully lesser carnivores off their kills. Then in 2006, based on his interpretation of isotopic studies, Sorkin also backed this giant bully scavenger hypothesis. But then in 2008, based again on isotopic data, Fox, Dobbs and others dusted off the carnivore hypothesis, and Arctodus, the giant superpredator, was back. And then, just when you thought that you might be able to relax and not lose any more sleep over the paleoecology of the giant bear on your Wheaties packet, in 2010, Borja Figueiredo and friends came up with this inflammatory piece of work, demythologizing Arctodus simus, the short-faced, long-legged and predaceous bear that never was. I mean, what the? Our awesome, gigantic, mother of all North American super predators just completely disappeared. Borgia and colleagues took a wide range of measurements from the skulls and skeletons of living bears, as well as Arctodus, ran a bunch of analyses, and concluded that yes, Arctodus was a giant, but that the super predator story pretty much ended there. It didn't have a particularly short face or long legs, and it wasn't particularly fast or carnivorous. Basically, it was just a giant, lumbering omnivore. Now, if you're starting to get a headache from all this toing and froing, I don't blame you. It's starting to hurt my head too. So I want to back up a bit and get down to basics. To paleontologists, arguably the best indicator of whether a mammal is an obligate herbivore or hypercarnivore or something in between is the relative size of its scissor-like meat-slicing teeth compared to its grinding, pulverizing back teeth. What we have here is a diagram that hopefully shows what I'm talking about. This is a dog skull, and below is its lower jaw. We can see that it has pretty long, high meat-cutting blades, denoted by the red lines. Behind it are relatively small, flat, grinding molars, highlighted in green. This is a really good indication that the mammalian carnivore we are looking at is mostly carnivorous, although it still retains some capacity to grind and process other foods. This relationship between blade length and grinding area is mirrored in the upper teeth. Now, if you look at a cat skull here, we can see that the meat slicing blade is relatively much longer and that there is basically no grinding area available for processing plant food. That's a hypercarnivore right there. Now, regarding bear evolution, it seems that after a pretty carnivorous start, they went through a really omnivorous bottleneck. They evolved large grinding areas and smaller meat slicing blades. Effectively, there was a complete restart, and all living bears are descended from an ancestor with this more omnivorous dentition. From this point, things get really messy. In some lineages, this trend continued, while in others, it flipped again to longer meat shearing blades and smaller grinding areas. The panda bear here is an obvious example of massive expansion of the grinding area, which they use to pulverize bamboo, and there is no obvious meat shearing blade at all. There is a small shearing blade and a less extreme meat grinding area in the brown bear to the right. And then moving right along, we have the most carnivorous living bear, the polar bear. Its meat slicing blade is a little longer and the crushing area smaller still. This trend is taken a step further in Arctodus on the far right, which in theory certainly suggests that it included a still greater proportion of meat in its diet. However, just for that matter. Another point here regarding living bears is that their cranial mechanics appear to be completely arse about. In all other mammalian carnivore families, a powerful bite and a short skull correlates with increased carnivory and a tendency to take relatively larger prey. But in this 2012 paper here by Chris Oldfield, myself, and others, we showed that the most herbivorous bear, the panda, had the most powerful bite for its size and a skull well adapted to take powerful biting forces. On the other end of the spectrum, the most carnivorous species, the polar bear, had the weakest bite for its size and a skull that was poorly adapted to take high bite forces. So what's going on? Now, in our 2012 study, we did include a big short-faced bear, Agrotherium. This African species was not closely related, but its skull was very similar in shape to that of Arctodus, and like Arctodus, its shearing blades are relatively long and its grinding surfaces relatively small for a modern bear. And we found that this African short-faced bear had a way more powerful bite than the polar bear, and further that it was way better adapted to take big bite forces, as well as the kinds of forces that you would expect to encounter from large struggling prey. In fact, with a bite force at its canine teeth of over 4,500 newtons, it had a more powerful bite than any other terrestrial mammal that anyone's predicted bite forces for. And there's no doubt in my mind that Arctodus would have had a way bigger bite still, and massively bigger than a polar bear's. Please explain, I hear you say. Well, bamboo takes a lot of effort to pulverize, which kind of explains what's going on with the panda. And regarding the polar bear, although occasionally they go for larger prey, even trap beluga whales when the opportunity presents itself, the reality is that its diet mostly comprises juvenile seals, which frankly aren't particularly large or hard to kill. Not only that, polar bears preferentially just suck out the fat as opposed to slicing out the meat. In fact, technically, the polar bear might be better classed as a fativore or lipivore than a carnivore. Recent work, published here in 2022 by Robbins et al., has shown that living bears in general, from the panda to the polar bear, are actually not well adapted to a diet that's high in protein, that is, meat. It seems likely that this may apply to Arctodus as well. Okay, let's take another breath. At this point, I would say that overall, skull, tooth shape, and biomechanics suggest that Arctodus was likely more carnivorous than any living bear, with the possible exception of the polar bear. And if it was an active predator, it had the capacity at least to kill much bigger prey than the polar bear. But of course, this anatomy might be considered consistent with that of a scavenger, as has been previously argued. However, in 2013, the argument that Arctodus was just a big bullying scavenger took another hit. In this paper, Donahue and friends looked at the fine microwear of Arctodus teeth from La Brea in California and determined that it wasn't processing much bone, which is obviously inconsistent with Arctodus the scavenger. So, if it was eating other animals, it seems that it was typically killing them itself, i.e., it was a bona fide predator. And then another isotope study here by Perez Crespo and friends in 2016 on Mexican Arctodus came in with a result consistent with those from Alaska. That is, it was eating a lot of animals, further strengthening the super predator argument. But then in 2017, not satisfied with showing that the giant long-legged short-faced bear didn't exist, Borja Figueiredo here analysed Arctodus teeth from La Brea and the far northwest and found that there was a pretty high incidence of tooth decay in the Californian bears. This suggests that Californian Arctodus were consuming significant quantities of carbohydrate, that is, plant material. I mean, really? Anyway, this suggests that Alaskan and Mexican Arctodus were more carnivorous than their Californian brothers and sisters. Of course, they all clearly retained a capacity to process plant material, whether they chose to or not. And this leads to the obvious question of just how much plant material in the diet is significant. At what point does an omnivorous bear become a carnivorous one? Even polar bears regularly eat plants. Analysis of polar bear crap has found that up to 85% of their scats include plant material, ranging from berries to marine algae, for heaven's sake. Well, a widely accepted interpretation is that a hypercarnivore gets more than 70% of its nutrition from eating other animals, and a meso or middle carnivore gets between around 30 and 70% of its diet from meat. This makes the polar bear with a 90% meat-fat diet a hypercarnivore, even though it regularly consumes plants. And of course, the amount of plant material will depend on the season and the location. As to the definition of an omnivore, well, frankly, there's no widely accepted proportion of meat to plant material in the diet that makes an animal an omnivore. And I'm pretty sure that many so-called omnivores would be more correctly categorized as mesocarnivores. To me, categorizing Arctodus as an omnivore really doesn't mean much. Frankly, it's a bit of a cop-out. So where does this leave us? Well, one thing I'm pretty sure of is that Alaskan Arctodus in the cold deep north ate more meat than their southern cousins, if for no other reason that there was less plant material around for most of the year. And interestingly, it now appears that these two populations were genetically very distinct as determined by these guys, Pedersen and friends, in 2021. In conclusion, what do I reckon based on the available evidence? Well, here's my call. I reckon that all Arctodus simus were more carnivorous than any living bear, excluding probably the polar bear. And at a bare minimum, so to speak, I'd say that all were mesocarnivores. Lastly, I'm going to take it a step further and say that if I were a betting man, I'd bet that Alaskan giant short-faced bears got 70% or more of their nutrition from meat and or fat. In short, they were hypercarnivores and active predators who, like all predators, weren't above indulging in a bit of scavenging. And that concludes this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please like and subscribe, and maybe leave a comment in the comments section. I'll present another episode next week. You can tell me which species you'd prefer.